My name is Harold. Wait, no. Let me start over. I'm going to tell you something that took me a long time to put into words. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years driving a school bus for the Maplewood Unified School District in Central Ohio, and in all that time, I thought I understood children pretty well. I thought I knew when a kid was hurting. I thought I could read the signs. I was wrong. The hardest lesson I ever learned didn't come from those bus routes. It came from inside my own house, so take a breath before you keep reading. What happened under my roof, while I trusted the wrong person completely, is something I still wake up thinking about at 3 in the morning. My daughter's name is Lily. No, I need different names. My granddaughter. That's who this story is really about. Let me start from the beginning, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. My name is Gus Farley. I'm 63 years old and I live in Delphos, Ohio, a small town about halfway between Lima and Fort Wayne, the kind of place where everybody knows your truck and waves at you from their porch. I retired early from driving bus on account of my knee. My wife, Pauline, passed from ovarian cancer 6 years ago, and that loss still sits in my chest like a stone I've learned to carry rather than set down. After Pauline died, our daughter, Renee, 29 at the time, moved back home with her husband, a man named Bryson, and their little girl, Sadie. Sadie was 4 years old when they moved in. She had her grandmother's eyes, dark brown, wide, and full of something that felt like old wisdom sitting inside a little child's face. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I did not see what was coming. I am not the kind of man who misses things. I drove a bus full of children for 3 decades. I notice when a kid is flinching, when their lunchbox is empty 3 days in a row, when they've stopped talking to the friend they used to sit beside. That was my whole career, paying attention. But when you love someone, really love them, there is a particular kind of blindness that comes with it. You make excuses without even knowing you're making them. You see a shadow on the wall and tell yourself it's just the light. That's what I did. For almost 8 months, that's exactly what I did. Renee and Bryson had been married 4 years when they moved in. I thought Bryson was all right, quiet, kept to himself. He worked remotely doing something with software that I never fully understood, and he spent most of the day in the back bedroom with his laptop. He wasn't warm. Not the kind of son-in-law who claps you on the shoulder and asks about your fantasy football picks. But I told myself that was just his personality. Some men aren't talkers. That's fine. I'm not always a talker either. Renee worked days at the insurance office in town. She left at 7:30 every morning and was usually home by 5:30. During those hours, Sadie was home with Bryson. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Sadie would come running when I got home from the hardware store or the diner. She'd grab my hand and pull me toward the backyard to show me a caterpillar she'd found or a rock she'd decided was special. She called me Papa Gus. That was her idea, not mine. It still makes my throat tighten to think about it. But somewhere around the 4-month mark, something shifted. I noticed it the way you notice the weather changing. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of small things that add up before you can name them. Sadie stopped running to the door when I came home. She started sitting very still on the couch, watching cartoons with a kind of blank attention that didn't look like a child watching cartoons. It looked like a child trying to disappear into the furniture. She had dark circles under her eyes. I asked Renee if Sadie was sleeping all right. Renee said yes. She always went to bed at 8. She was probably just going through a phase. Kids go through phases. Renee's pediatrician had said something similar when Renee was small. I accepted this, but then I noticed she wasn't eating much at dinner. She would push her food around the plate and watch Bryson out of the corner of her eye. Not the way a child watches an adult they're trying to impress. The way a child watches something they're afraid might move. I told myself I was imagining it. Then one Saturday morning, I was in the backyard, pulling weeds along the fence line. Sadie was playing on the little wooden playset I'd built for her the summer before. The one with the slide and the rope ladder and the tire swing that Pauline had picked out online 2 weeks before she got sick. Sadie used to love that playset. She could spend 2 hours out there by herself, narrating elaborate games to an audience of one. That morning she wasn't playing. She was sitting at the top of the slide with her knees pulled up to her chest, just staring at the back of the house. I walked over and climbed up to sit beside her. The wood creaked under my weight. I said, "Hey, Ladybug, what are you thinking about so hard?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "Papa Gus, do you think fish can hear?" I said I thought they probably could. Then I asked if something was bothering her. She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were doing that old wisdom thing again. That thing that made her look like she was carrying more than any 5-year-old should have to carry. Then she said, "I'm not supposed to say." I felt something cold move through me, but I told myself that it was probably something ordinary, a surprise she wasn't supposed to spoil, a secret between kids, something small and innocent that I was reading wrong, because I was a widower who lived alone in a house that was too quiet, and I was probably just looking for things to worry about. That is what I told myself. I went inside and made her a peanut butter and banana sandwich, her favorite, and I set it on the kitchen table and called her in, and I watched her eat it with the careful, mechanical focus of a child who is very hungry but doesn't want anyone to notice. That night I lay awake for a long time. The thing that finally broke through my denial was a Tuesday evening in early March. Renee was at her book club. Bryson had put Sadie to bed around 7:30, early even for her, and then went back to his room. I was in the living room reading. The house was quiet. Around 9 o'clock I got up to get a glass of water, and I walked past Sadie's door. I heard her crying. Not loud. She was trying to be quiet about it, which was somehow worse than if she'd been wailing. It was the sound of a child who has learned that crying loud gets you in trouble. I knocked softly and pushed the door open. She was curled up on her side in the bed, still in her clothes. She hadn't been changed into pajamas. When she saw it was me, she sat up fast and wiped her face with her sleeve. I sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Sadie, honey, talk to Papa Gus." She shook her head. I said, "You can tell me anything, I promise you that. Anything at all." She looked at the door, then she looked at me. Then she whispered, "He says if I tell, it'll make Mommy sad, and then it'll be my fault." The cold thing moved through me again. This time I didn't push it away. I said, very carefully, "Nobody is going to be sad, and nothing is ever your fault. Do you understand me?" She didn't answer, but she scooted across the bed and pressed herself against my arm the way she used to when she was 3, and I put my arm around her, and I sat there until she fell asleep. I did not sleep at all that night. I called my brother-in-law the next morning, Pauline's older brother, a man named Roy, who spent 20 years as a deputy sheriff in Auglaize County before he retired. I trusted Roy. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd heard, all of it. Roy didn't tell me I was overreacting. He said, "Gus, I've seen this before. You need to be careful how you move on this, because if you go in loud and wrong, it can make things harder to prosecute later. Document what you can. Don't tip them off. And call Children's Services, but not until you have something concrete." He also said something I've thought about many times since. Trust your gut. You know that kid. You've known her since she was born. If your gut says something's wrong, something's wrong. I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at my coffee cup. Then I drove to the electronics store over in Lima, and I bought a small wireless camera, the kind that looks like a smoke detector. I brought it home. I waited until Bryson took his afternoon walk, which he did every day around 2:30, and Sadie was down for what used to be her nap, but lately she just lay there with her eyes open. I went into her room and mounted it in the corner above her bookshelf. It was small enough that you'd have to know what you were looking for to notice it. I told myself I was probably going to feel foolish when I watched the footage and saw nothing unusual. I told myself I was an old man who had too much time to think and not enough sense to mind his own business. I set up the camera on a Thursday. By Saturday morning, I wished I had set it up 8 months earlier. The first night, nothing. Sadie went to bed around 8. Bryson checked on her once, briefly, around 9. That was it. The second night, I almost talked myself out of checking the footage at all, but I did check it. I checked it at 6 in the morning while the house was still quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee that went cold before I touched it. At 11:47 p.m., the bedroom door opened. Bryson came in. He didn't turn on the light. The camera had night vision. Everything was that grainy green color, but it was clear enough. He walked to Sadie's bed. She was asleep. He shook her shoulder until she woke up. What happened next took about 12 minutes. I'm not going to describe every detail. I don't think I could even if I wanted to. What I will tell you is that those 12 minutes were the longest of my life, and that by the end of them I was sitting very still at my kitchen table, with my hands flat on the surface, and my breathing very deliberate, in through the nose, out through the mouth, because I knew that if I moved too fast or reacted too big, I would do something I couldn't take back. He was not physically hurting her, but what he was doing was a kind of harm that doesn't leave marks on skin. He was using the dark and her sleepiness and the weight of his voice to do something to her sense of herself that I didn't have words for then and barely have words for now. He was making her believe things about herself. Bad things. The kind of things that, once planted in a child's mind, can grow for years before anyone even knows they're there. When he left the room and shut the door, I heard her crying again, quiet, trying not to make noise. I sat at that table for 45 minutes. Then I called Roy. Roy came over that same morning. He watched the footage with me. He didn't say much while he watched it. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He said, "Gus, this is psychological abuse. It's serious. This needs to go to authorities today. But you need to do it right." He made some calls. He knew people. By noon, we had an appointment with a caseworker at Auglaize County Children's Services. By the time Renee came home from the gym at 1 o'clock, we were sitting in the living room waiting for her. That was the hardest conversation of my life. Harder than telling Renee her mother was gone. Harder than anything. She didn't believe me at first. She couldn't. I watched her face go through 5 different kinds of grief in about 4 minutes, and then she watched the footage herself, and I sat beside her and held her hand, and when it was over, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How long?" And I said I didn't know, but probably longer than we thought. She started crying in a way that was very silent, like Sadie, and I realized then where Sadie had learned to cry that way. She had learned it by watching her mother try not to fall apart in front of someone who would use it against her. Bryson was gone from the house by that evening. Renee asked him to leave, and he left, which told me something. Guilty people often leave when you give them the door, because staying means answering questions they can't answer. He took his laptop and 2 bags of clothes and drove away, and I watched the taillights of his car disappear down Maple Street and felt something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite satisfaction. It was more like the feeling you get when a storm is finally over, and you're standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what to rebuild first. The authorities had his name by then. The footage had been submitted. Roy's contacts in the county had made sure the case was handled properly from the start. Bryson was formally charged with child endangerment and emotional abuse of a minor, both serious charges in the state of Ohio, within 2 weeks of the footage being turned over. There was also the matter of his mother. We found out, through the investigation, that Bryson had spoken to his mother about Sadie. Not specifics, nothing that would constitute confessing, but enough that she had suspected something was wrong and said nothing, done nothing. His mother lived 40 minutes away in Van Wert and had seen Sadie twice during those 8 months and had noticed, by her own admission later, that Sadie seemed nervous around her son. She did nothing. I want to be honest with you. That piece of information hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, because it meant that Sadie had been seen, that an adult who cared about that family had picked up on the signs, and still, nobody acted. His mother was not charged. There wasn't enough for a criminal charge, but I want you to know she was there, and she saw, and she chose silence over a 5-year-old child's safety. That is something she will have to live with. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be careful not to make this sound like it wrapped up cleanly, because it did not. Sadie started seeing a child therapist in Lima, a woman who specialized in early childhood trauma, and who had a waiting room full of picture books and 2 therapy dogs named Biscuit and Scout. Sadie liked Biscuit especially. She started asking to go to her appointments, which the therapist said was a very good sign. Renee moved into therapy too. She had her own things to untangle, her own questions about what she had missed, what she had excused, what she had told herself to keep the peace. I won't speak for her experience. That's her story to tell. But I will say I have never been more proud of my daughter than I have been in the months since. Watching her do the hard, unglamorous work of putting herself back together for the sake of her child. I sold Bryson's recliner. That's a small detail, but it felt important at the time. Sadie had good days and bad days. Some morning she woke up and came padding into the kitchen in her socks and asked for pancakes and talked my ear off about her imaginary horse named Cracker, and it felt almost like before. Other mornings she woke up in the night and couldn't get back to sleep, and I'd hear her through the wall, and I'd go in and sit with her and read to her until she drifted off. There was one night, about 6 weeks in, when she climbed into my lap while I was sitting in Pauline's old reading chair in the living room. She was getting a little big for that, really, but I wasn't going to say so. She put her head under my chin and said, "Papa Gus, are you going to stay here?" I said, "Ladybug, I'm not going anywhere." She said, "Good, because you make the bad feelings smaller." I didn't trust myself to speak for a minute. I just held on to her and looked out the window at the street and thought about Pauline and about Renee and about the particular cruelty of harm that comes from inside a family. How it poisons the water you drink every day without tasting like poison. I thought about all the times I'd almost missed it, all the excuses I'd made, the phases, the light playing tricks. I made a decision that night to retire for good from thinking of myself as someone who sits in his reading chair and minds his own business. That season of my life was over. The divorce was finalized 7 months after Bryson left the house. Renee has full custody. Bryson has no visitation rights pending the outcome of the criminal case, and his attorney, from what Roy told me, has been trying to negotiate a plea arrangement that would likely result in probation and mandatory counseling rather than prison time. As of right now, that case is still working its way through the system. The wheels of family court in a rural Ohio county turn slowly, and not always in the direction you want them to. I will be honest, that part is hard for me. I am 63 years old and I believe in justice, and justice in this situation has looked a lot more like paperwork and continuances than it has looked like anything satisfying. Renee's attorney tells me to be patient. Roy tells me to be patient. I am trying. What I can tell you is that Sadie's therapist, at their session 2 months ago, observed that Sadie was showing significant improvement in self-expression and emotional regulation. Those were her exact words, and I wrote them down in a notebook I keep on my nightstand. Significant improvement. I read that phrase sometimes when the nights are long. Sadie turned 6 in April. We had a birthday party in the backyard. Renee's friends, a few neighbors, Sadie's kindergarten class, streamers the same orange as a traffic cone, because that was Sadie's current favorite color. I grilled hot dogs. Roy brought potato salad. Sadie ran around in the grass with a half-dozen 5- and 6-year-olds, shrieking about something to do with fairies, and at one point she ran past me and grabbed my hand without slowing down, just grabbed it and squeezed it once and kept running. I stood in the backyard in the late April sun, and I thought, this is what it's supposed to look like. This right here. There are things I want to say to any parent or grandparent watching this, because I know that's who you are. I can tell by the questions that matter to you and the things that keep you up at night. The signs were there. They were there for months before I acted on them. The circles under the eyes, the stillness that doesn't belong on a child, the way she watched him from the corner of her eye at the dinner table, the crying that was too quiet, the I'm not supposed to say. Those are not phases. Those are not children being dramatic. Those are signals. I am not a medical professional, and I am not a counselor. But I drove a bus full of children for 31 years, and I am telling you from the most painful personal experience of my life. If your gut is telling you something is wrong, something is wrong. Do not wait until you have proof you feel certain about. Do not tell yourself it's probably nothing. Make the call. Talk to someone. Set up the camera if you have to. Because here is the thing nobody tells you about harm that happens in the dark. It only survives as long as nobody turns on the light. I turned on the light. I wish I had done it sooner, but I did it, and Sadie is running through the backyard in orange streamers, and that is enough to build on. That is more than enough. I learned to pay attention again, really pay attention, the way I used to on those early morning bus routes, when I could tell which kids needed a nod and which ones needed a minute. I learned that love without vigilance is not enough protection for a child. I learned that the most dangerous thing in a family is silence. And I learned that you are never too old, and it is never too late, to be the person who stands between a child and the dark. Sadie is going to be okay. I know this the way I know weather, not from data but from years and paying attention, and something that sits in your chest and doesn't lie. She's going to be okay. And on the nights when I'm not sure, On the nights when I hear her through the wall and I go in and sit with her and read to her until she falls asleep, I remind myself that I am there, I am present, and every night I am there is a night that she is not alone. That's the job now. That's the only job that matters.